freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. As always, I am your host, Nico Perino. It's been a couple of weeks, or maybe even a couple of months, I can't remember, since we last checked in with my colleagues here at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. The last time we did check in, we were talking about how busy this past summer has been for us. We saw a dramatic rise in our case submissions and visitors to our website, signaling increased interest in FIRE's work. I'm sorry to say that interest in our work remains, partly because the threats to free speech, due process, academic freedom, and a free press remain on campus. And I am joined today by my colleague, Robert Shibley. He's the executive director of FIRE, and my other colleague, Adam Goldstein, who is senior research counsel to the president of FIRE. That is, of course, Greg Lukianoff. Robert and Adam, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks.
So we're going to discuss some of the most recent cases that FIRE has seen, some of the most egregious cases that FIRE has seen. And I want to return to my old stomping grounds of New York State. I'm now not in New York State, but I was there for a long time, to talk about a case that we have at St. John's University, which I believe is in Queens, Adam?
I believe that's right, yeah.
Over in Queens at St. John's University, we had a professor there, Richard Taylor, who was teaching a history class on the subject of the Columbian Exchange. Not something I was familiar with, although I was familiar with the idea that there was this process of globalization that began in the 15th century and all of that, what that entailed. But the Columbian Exchange is what we call that process of globalization. And in Professor Taylor's discussion of the Columbian Exchange, he talked about the good things that came along with it, including increased trade, new discoveries. But he also discussed some of the bad things that came along with it, including the slave trade. And during the course of his discussion of the Columbian Exchange, he asked his students if the positives of the exchange justified the negatives. Now, our listeners might anticipate some of the problems that might create in the discussion in our modern age, where everyone is looking to be offended, some might say. But Adam, there was considerable backlash and, in this case, punishment of Professor Taylor, correct?
There was. At the time, I should say that Taylor had two sections of this intro to history course, each with about 30 students. One student in the morning section objected and said there's no justification for slavery, and he clarified, well, I'm not asking anyone to justify slavery. Slavery can't be justified. I'm asking people to consider the effects of things like biodiversity and saving people from famine. This student made a complaint to the school, but more importantly, they told a student activist group, SJU Radicals, SJU for St. John's University Radicals, which then created a form letter that students could, well, not just students, anyone could put in their email and send a letter complaining about this
discussion topic.
Well, this discussion topic, I say that, although the discussion topic that was actually being claimed in the letter was the letter claims that the professor asked them to justify slavery, which obviously was not what the assignment
But I mean, let's
was.
be clear. I mean, it is one of the negatives that he was discussing in the course, so it's not, and I want to say, as a former history major, that it's not an unusual question to ask. I recall it being asked of me in my U.S. history classes 3 or 4 times with regard to the creation of the United States Constitution, in which the founders of America had a compromise essentially on slavery that allowed the Constitution to be ratified. You were often asked, whether the compromise was worth it. The idea being that, if was it worth it to allow slavery in order for the Constitution to come into being? because I think most historians would say without that compromise, you might not have a United States of America. You might have two separate countries. And then there's also, of course, the contextual discussion that comes around these sorts of, do the positives justify the negatives? Insofar as in the 15th century during the Columbian Exchange, slavery was worldwide, essentially. There were very few countries that didn't have it. So just adding a little bit of color there to how common these sorts of questions are, and these questions, of course, do not diminish the serious problems and obvious problems that come along with the oppression, subjugation, and enslavement of human beings.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I think as a thought exercise, it's completely valid. It's also a question that we can never ultimately answer, right? It's a moving target. How we evaluate the United States today is different than how we evaluated 100 years ago. How we're going to evaluate it in 100 years, if all things being equal, we're still here in 100 years. The point of asking the question isn't to arrive at a conclusion, but to think about all the consequences of history.
Yeah, and in doing that, Professor Taylor was asking his students to do what most liberal arts professors do, which is think critically about history. But that resulted in something like 300 complaints of misconduct against him. Many of those complaints prompted by the SJU Radicals Instagram page, asking people to write in, complaining about Professor Taylor's discussion topic. Now, one of the funny things about this case, or I should say the sad things about these cases, is that he only had 30 students in the class. I think he had two classes, right? 30 students in each. So 300 of these complainants weren't actually in the classroom and didn't know the context.
Right. At the time he was, after these complaints were made, eventually he was called into a meeting with a Title IX coordinator and was told that there were over 300 complaints against him, which, as you pointed out, surprised him because the math didn't exactly work. At that point, the coordinator explained to him there were 300 email complaints and then one in-person complaint.
Now, what actually happened? So the director of equal opportunity and compliance, Keaton Wong, informed Taylor of these complaints. What happened next? Was he told what policies he was being investigated under? Was he told whether this was a serious investigation? What happened next?
He had a meeting with the investigator and a union rep, and was told that he was accused of violating the school's bias policy. The bias policy is several pages long and covers everything from sexual harassment to hostile environment to outright racism. He wasn't told specifically what it was about this alleged question that would have violated that policy. He did, however, provide the investigator with a copy of his PowerPoint that he used in the presentation and his notes, and said that this isn't the question I asked. He left the meeting and then didn't hear anything for a couple weeks.
And then when he did hear things, he was told that he was found in violation of that policy, which is 2,300 words long. But he was not told what specific part of the policy he is said to have violated, right? And was he allowed for an appeal?
He was not. The result of the investigation, as he got it, was a 3-paragraph letter that told him there was an investigation, didn't say what evidence it considered, just that an investigation happened, and that as a result of the investigation, he was found to have violated the policy, and didn't say how he violated the policy. And the last paragraph was devoted to telling him this was a final decision he could not appeal. Yeah,
so he doesn't even know exactly what he did, right? I mean, it could have been the discussion prompt, and we're assuming it was, because that was the subject of the SJU Radicals' Instagram post. But it could have been anything, because they didn't provide any context as to what he was being charged for, and the evidence to support that charge. And that was kind of that, right? He was told he would continue to get paid, but he couldn't teach. At least through the current semester. He was also categorically forbidden to guest lecture in any other professor's class. And those punishments create two additional problems, one of which is that he is a PhD student. So he's not, a tenured professor or anything, but he does teach at the school. And in order to get your PhD, there is a teaching requirement. How do you fulfill that now? He asked about it, and last I heard, he wasn't given any response. And then he is, and this is another wrinkle to the story, a 9/11 survivor, a first responder. I believe he was in the New York City Police Department for something like a decade, which is another reason the SJU radicals didn't like him. And he was also a member of the United States military, and he typically guest lectures for other professors on campus on those topics. Is he now not allowed to go into those classrooms and guest lecture as part of his prohibition from stepping on campus? I don't know. Where do things currently stand with him, Adam?
Well, that is a good summary of the status quo, but he had to wait a week after the letter telling him he was responsible to find out any of that. The letter just told him he was responsible and that he'd have to meet with his dean to figure out more. And it was in that period between the letter finding him responsible, which I always thought was funny that the letter said he couldn't appeal it because it gave him no idea what the evidence was or what it was he was alleged to have done, which would make it impossible to appeal if there were an appeal mechanism. I'm appealing this finding about this thing I don't know about based on this evidence I don't have. I mean, it's tough to make an appeal out of that.
Maybe it was just a factual observation that he wasn't able to appeal.
Right. It was just like, we're not telling you can't, but good luck, right? Like,
one thing that folks should know is that there is absolutely nothing unusual in the idea that professors or students are being punished fairly severely for things that they actually they sincerely are not sure what they are supposed to have done. That is a very common tactic that's used by universities. And frankly, it's appalling, although it's routine, but it's also something that we've seen, particularly in the Title IX context, but in other, context, universities pushing back against FIRE's attempts to get them to introduce some kind of meaningful process into things. But it's routine that they'll be, even in serious areas, not that this isn't serious, but like sexual misconduct, you might actually go to your trial having no clear idea of what exactly it is you're supposed to have done, or even necessarily who's accusing you. And universities have fought very hard to be able to continue to punish people on that basis. And it really is a moral failing, I think, of the highest order to think that you should have so little accountability that you don't even need to tell somebody what they did as a university administrator who's participating in what is allegedly some kind of fact-finding process to do this. And yet universities are absolutely without shame when it comes to demanding that they continue to be allowed to do this. And it's appalling that they do, but I wish it were more unusual than it is.
Well, they're also without shame in punishing professors as a result of outrage mobs online, which is essentially what you got here. And we've seen this countless times across the country, and during the past year, especially this summer, where there are groups mobilizing online. There is a professor who said something, maybe tweeted something, or had a screen grab of their Zoom class in the post-COVID era taken out of context, and they're investigated and in some cases punished. I mean, you'll recall earlier in the year, I believe it was in the University of California system, where a professor was explaining one of the most common filler words in the Chinese language and explaining what that word was, and it happened to sound like a racial slur. And this clip, it was of a Zoom class, was cut up, taken out of context, of course, and shared across the country and across the world. And the university subsequently investigated him for it. Ultimately, I do not believe there was any punishment, although I do think he was removed from that class. I don't recall if it was voluntarily or not. And coincidentally, the Chinese students at that university rose to his defense, saying, no, what he was doing there was using a common Chinese filler word to demonstrate a topic in a cross-cultural communications class. But the outrage mob does not care about that context, and the university, so eager to appease these mobs, is quick to jump in.
Yeah, and we have procedures and rules, like you're supposed to know what you're being charged with doing in order to be able to counter the effects of mob demands. Here, if you can't actually explain what somebody is supposed to have done, or in this case, he was actually being accused by this, form email that was sent to everybody of doing something that, as far as we can tell, and I'm not, obviously it's impossible to know what St. John's decided because they won't say, but doesn't appear to be even at all what happened. That's why we have these procedures. And so every time you decide one of them is unimportant, or you're simply not going to do it, you make yourself less and less resistant to the demands of a mob. That's, frankly, it's not overstating it to think that's kind of a brown shirt tactic, meaning that you have the authorities sort of conniving whether or not it is, actually coordinated, but you have the authorities relying on, mobs of people, whether they be in real life or just virtually, to do the work that the authorities want done, but can't really do themselves. And so it really is a very sinister way of doing business that's unfortunately de rigueur on college campuses right now.
I was visiting the Department of Justice, must have been last year sometime. And if you go into the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., you'll see a bunch of artwork on the walls. And the big mural that they have above their somewhat famous library, I think it's on the second floor, is, I forget the name of it, but it is a depiction of a man crawling up courthouse steps, being chased by a mob. One of the figures in the mob looks like a skeleton, essentially. They're carrying pitchforks. They're carrying lanterns. They're obviously out for blood for this guy. And standing on the courthouse steps is a judge holding up, the book of law, or, in this case, it could be the Constitution, with his hand outstretched at the mobs, saying no and welcoming the man crawling up the courthouse steps to seek refuge, behind the laws, behind the justice system from an otherwise angry mob that wants to expeditiously do away with whatever this with this man and whatever he is accused to have done. So that was a very moving mural to me when I first saw it, and very indicative of the thing we're trying to oppose here, which is, there is a process, there are rules for a reason, and we don't let whatever some sort of offended mob on the internet thinks decide who is guilty and who is not. Regardless of whatever you think of the Department of Justice, I know that there's many people on here who will call it the Department of Injustice. I think that artwork stands on its own as a symbolic reason behind why we have due process of law in this country.
Yeah, it's not exactly a subtle message.
No.
But at the same time, it's pretty obvious that it's one that you almost, maybe it could very easily be too subtle about, because I think people have, look, it's not most people, but there is a noisy minority of people right now who have completely disregarded that kind of very basic reason that we have a justice system, that regardless of whether or not the mob is even right, that's not the way we do justice in the United States. And to the extent that we normalize that kind of quote unquote justice, we are losing our way as a country, and frankly abandoning part of our national character.
Yeah. Another part of our national character, at least since the 1950s, of course, is that we do not stand for segregation, racial segregation in this country. And Robert, you recently wrote a letter to Portland, Oregon's Lewis and Clark College about an orientation program that they had. That was helped put on by some group based out of Portland. The program was called Engage in Racial Justice, but the program essentially, and it was mandatory as part of their orientation programming, required you to identify as black, white, and I think indigenous / person of color. And then as part of the programming, you were given separate educational experiences based on the color of your skin. And this was all mandatory and obviously a form of racial segregation, which is unlawful in the United States. Robert, how did we hear about this case? And, obviously, besides the obvious, why is it cause for concern?
Yeah, well, a professor at Lewis and Clark, Lyle Asher, let us know that this was happening. And I hate to say it, but it's not the first letter we've written in Fire's history about racially segregated educational experiences, although it has been a long time. It's no exaggeration, though, like you described, that it is literally, asking, it was a little mandatory box. You had to fill out your skin color and you had 3 choices. that you described, and then you were broken up into different Zoom rooms. I can only presume that when there's not a pandemic going on, this is done, in literally separate rooms. And the idea is that looking at the most favorable light, the idea is, well, people are more comfortable, I guess, talking about racial issues with people who are, nominally or identify with their own race. The problem with that is that it is unlawful. Well, okay, that's actually not the problem. Because there is the problem is that what you're doing there is you're actually delivering, like you said, a separate educational experience, a different one to people based solely on their ancestry, their genes, the color of their skin, not based on merit, not based on what they would prefer, not based on what they want, but you're saying you're black, go through this door, you're white, go through this door. And then we will do what we think is appropriate to do with black people and white people. We, in this country a long time ago, determined that separate was not equal functionally in this country, that there was just simply no way to make separate equal. This is not a controversial principle of law, or one that the authorities at Lewis and Clark, which is private, but is nevertheless, as you might imagine, private schools also cannot engage in racial segregation if they take federal funds, almost all of them. So there's no way that the people at Lewis and Clark didn't know they were engaging in segregation. In fact, we know that because Professor Asher actually emailed the president and the general counsel of Lewis and Clark and told them, basically, are you serious? Can you look into this? And they did nothing. They let it happen anyway. And so that's, can you imagine going to, we have students now, these students at Lewis and Clark who in the very, one of the very first few days of experiences at their new school as freshmen, got split up by race mandatorily and classified that way, and then got to have different experiences. Just imagine, in current year, as people like to say on the internet, going to college, and basically the first thing that happens to you is racial segregation. That's what. Talk about normalizing a bad idea. The communication of values there is basically that, things are so broken, or that, you just aren't capable of having these conversations with people who literally don't look like you. It's such a destructive thing when one puts even, 2 seconds of thought together for it. And the fact that we had to write a letter, I felt like in some ways I had to jump in a time machine and go backwards. I had to do some research into the cases that made segregation illegal, because you don't cite those very much these days, as you might imagine. It's not something you run into all the time. And then have them reply that they just don't think it's a big deal. That's what they came back, and they're like, well, it was only one time and we probably won't do it again, although they didn't promise it. And actually their response basically implied that, well, it was, the tone was sort of like, well, since we know it upsets one of our professors, we probably won't do it again. That's not the reason you don't engage in racial segregation. Get out of here.
Adam, did you want to say something?
Yeah, when you look at the cases, oh, sorry, yeah, I was going to talk about, we sort of went very quickly through, as we tend to, because everyone assumes it and understands it intrinsically to some degree, went through very quickly that segregation is illegal. And I wanted to just add a little bit of extra detail as to why that is, because we all sort of know it goes back to that Brown versus Board of Education case. What sort of happened leading up to that was you had Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP bringing cases to challenge school segregation in 4 different places. They lost 3 and won 1. And the strategy that eventually would cause them to win the 5th and final case, Brown versus Board of Ed, was to resort to science and resort to research showing that segregation itself was damaging. It didn't matter whether the facilities were equal necessarily, because the act of segregation was damaging. And that, when you consider that the act itself is damaging, and you make it an intrinsic element of your race training, you've sort of, you're setting yourself up for failure if your goal is to reduce racial bias.
Yeah, and everybody knows about, I guess I'm probably overstating. Everybody knows about Brown versus Board of Education. But one of the things I thought was interesting when I was doing the research, because I felt like just citing Brown versus Board of Education and, dropping the mic was not really the appropriate way to do it, was, finding the case that applied. And actually, believe it or not, in higher education, it was a 1950 case. It was 4 years before Brown versus Board of Education, if I'm doing the math right. It was McLaurin versus Oklahoma, and it was in that case I believe it was a black law student at the University of Oklahoma who was being segregated in really kind of very offensive. So meaningless but offensive ways. For instance, in the cafeteria, he had to sit at a different table. Like they didn't have two cafeterias for him because they hadn't had really black law students before that. So they had him sit at a separate table. In class, he had to sit in like a separate row, but he was in the same class and he could actually participate in class, although I don't know how willing you would be to participate in class. You just had sort of this, no entry toxin zone around you as a black person. And Oklahoma was saying, well, look, this is, he's getting his education. I mean, he's right there in class, he's in the same facilities, that sort of thing. And thankfully, the court did not buy that and pointed out that, no, that's a different educational experience. In some ways, though, he was actually still able to engage. If you're just a row away from your classmates, you can still ask the professor the same questions and hear it. Interestingly, in this situation with the Zoom segregation, that's literally impossible. So in some ways, you were more separated from people who had a different skin color than they were in 1950 in that landmark case about higher ed. Brown versus Board of Education is the one that got rid of it in all education, and particularly in K through 12, where it was a huge issue. But it actually hit higher ed first. So that was something that was news to me. Again, First Amendment lawyer here and doing civil liberties, but it's not a part of the law you expect to have to apply a whole lot. So while maybe maybe everybody else already knew that, it was certainly a learning experience for me.
Yeah, and Lewis and Clark still hasn't really given us the full-throated rejection of these racial segregation programs that we hope they would. And you can go to FIRE's website and use our Take Action portal to demand that they do full-throatedly reject racial segregation in the future. And I should say that you can do the same with that aforementioned or discussed St. John's case. We're still looking for a positive resolution to that case as well.
Can I add one more thing about St. John's?
Yeah,
as long as you bring it up again. As that Richard Taylor, the professor in question, is being represented by Schlamm, Stone and Dolan, a boutique litigation firm.
Oh, okay, so it's going to.
So they're working on getting a positive resolution.
Very good. And I should also take this opportunity to plug FIRE's legal network. So a lot of these cases run through our individual rights defense program, but the people we're helping could benefit from formal representation from an attorney. Sometimes we take cases here in-house through our litigation department at FIRE, but not always. Not every case is well suited for that. Often there are employment law issues that need to be dealt with that just, isn't our forte. So if you're a lawyer out there listening to this podcast and you want to join the FIRE Legal Network, you can just go to our website, in the search bar, type in FIRE Legal Network, and there will be a form where you can submit your information and become a part of that network. And then when we do have one of these cases, and it's within your state, we'll shoot every lawyer in that state an email, giving them the opportunity to potentially review the case and take on that student or that faculty member or that student group as a client. So I'd urge you all to do that. Robert, before we close the book on Lewis and Clark, I want to ask you a little bit about thought reform. FIRE, since its founding, has been concerned about orientation programming and other programming that seeks to reform students' thoughts. We, as part of our Guide to Student Rights on Campus, we have a book about thought reform programming. And while we're talking about racial segregation in the context of this Engage in Racial Justice program that Lewis and Clark put on, since this summer, since the racial justice protests that followed the George Floyd killing, we've been seeing a rise, or at least a rise in interest in anti-racism programming. Some of that programming has raised thought reform questions for FIRE. A lot of students writing into us, faculty members as well, concerned about these programs. How should listeners think about these sorts of programs, and when do they venture in to the thought reform territory?
Right. Well, thought reform has always been a harder nut to crack because, broadly speaking, education, teaching someone to think critically is kind of a form of that. But when we say thought reform at FIRE, we mean basically using the coercive power of the authorities to tell people that they need to change their thoughts, basically change their opinions to conform with those that are being promulgated by the authorities, and that there is, generally speaking, some kind of coercion or punishment involved in doing so. We're not. This is when what you have to look for when you're considering these things is when the message and the effort goes from trying to convince somebody that you're right to telling them that they have to say that you're right, or that they have to believe that you are right, and that does, that level of coercion is what, I think really takes it into the realm of what I think we can properly consider to be the sort of menacing thought reform rather than education. There's no harm, and in fact, there's a lot of benefit in learning about different perspectives. Certainly, in learning the law around discrimination is important to know. You don't want to fall afoul of the law. That's a recipe for disaster. And and also learning, various different beliefs about it. Recommended ways to behave around people can sometimes, although I think probably a lot less frequently than schools think, can sometimes be helpful. But when you see things like, like Lewis and Clark, which is a good example where there is that element of coercion based on your skin color, or what we're seeing a lot of now is students and professors coming to us and saying they have a online often, but sometimes in-person orientation program where in order to advance, for instance, like let's say they have a mandatory orientation thing, you've got to go through this online platform and they ask you questions about things like, what's the right thing to do in this situation? Somebody says, a racial slur to another person. What should you do? When those are asking you, what we'll see frequently is they'll say, they'll give you 3 or 4 answers. If one of them is like, I don't say anything because it's none of my business. I don't want to get involved. You might say, maybe you think that's the answer because you don't really want to get involved. And as an American, you are not required to get involved in what 2 other people are talking about. That simply isn't something you're not compelled to do that. But then you'll click like, I don't want to get involved. And they'll say, sorry, try again. And basically you can't advance through the thing until you give them the answer that they are seeking, or that you acknowledge that they are right about it. And that can be a pretty fact-intensive inquiry, because they're allowed to ask you what they think you should do, but they can't ask you they can't make you say what you actually should do. And so it can be a tough thing. And often people come to us with these things that, frankly, I can easily see why people of all races, frankly, would be offended by some of the questions that are being asked. They can seem insulting. They can seem reductive based on race, sex, etc. But that doesn't necessarily make them thought reform. What does is when there's that added element of coercion, you have to do this and you have to give us the right answers on this, or you cannot go on with your education. And we are, I think, seeing more. I mean, we're definitely seeing an uptick in that in this, the anti-racism education, as opposed to, there's always been an element of it in education about discrimination, but because I think the ideology, and obviously people can argue about it, but the ideology of anti-racism, part of that generally says that, doing nothing is itself a form of racism. The inherent conflict in there is, if, the thing they're requiring you to do is to think or say certain things, that's absolutely prohibited by the Constitution, for very good reason. For the same reason that in West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, they determined that Jehovah's Witnesses couldn't be made to salute the flag. There are some things you don't have to pledge allegiance to. The government cannot make you do that. And yet here, I think we're seeing the government, in the case of state universities and just more generally the authorities, in the case of private universities, do exactly that. And it is very worrisome.
Well, just to provide clarity for our listeners, there are often, almost all of our listeners will have taken a test at some point where there are right and wrong answers, or where you have to fill out an essay prompt or respond to an essay prompt in which the answer can be variable and you have to provide supporting evidence. Those aren't the sort of things we're talking about here. We're talking about highly debated concepts in which the authorities are essentially telling you that there is only one right answer, correct?
That is 100% correct. If it's the difference. If they want to ask, is the world round, or is it not? One of those answers is wrong and the other one is right. If they're asking you sort of, what should the world be like? What would be the best shape of the world? More realistically, what kind of system should we have? And if only communism or only capitalism were going to be the right answer, that would start to get more into the realm of thought reform. And you're right; the rubber really hits the road though on these very controversial ideas, such as all white people racist? For instance, is one that you'll see. Like, are you racist simply by having the skin color of a majority group and benefiting from the fact that people see you as that skin color? Does that make you a racist? There are a lot of people who would argue yes. There are a lot of people, probably more people, who would argue no. But you might see questions like that on some of these things, and if you're made to say that yes, that does make you racist, and you don't believe that, that's an example of coercive thought reform.
I want to turn now to Texas, where on September 30th, the Young Conservative of Texas chapter at the University of North Texas placed a pro-life display, I think around 1,000 flags, on the campus lawn. And later that same day, about a third of the flags and several of the group's signs were stolen. Adam, you recently wrote about this for Fire's news desk and talked about the response from the dean, I believe, of students at the University of North Texas. Her name is Maureen McGinnis. She had a meeting with the UNT or YCT UNT chairman Kelly Neidert and the group's advisor, in which she said, they couldn't really condemn this because that would be a form, condemn this vandalism because that would be a form of heckler's veto, which signals a misunderstanding on her part of what a heckler's veto is. Adam, can you talk a little bit about this case and the context and why it was so concerning to you that you thought you should write about it?
Absolutely. I should say, having done this for a few years now, I know Robert would agree, you sort of see the same fact patterns pop up. And every so often you get a fact pattern that looks very familiar with one little twist or one thing about it that changes how you react to it or what you think about it. And I've seen many instances of flags being put on lawns for one memorial or another. I've seen them be trampled. I've seen them be stolen. But this is the first time I've ever heard of a school administrator talking deferentially about the heckler's veto, about talking about the school's fear that they should trample on the right of hecklers to censor people.
Yeah. And Maureen McGinnis, in this case, I think we have a quote from her. This is what she said. She said, and she was saying this to the Young Conservatives chapter, because your event was free speech, somebody could come back and say, there's heckler's veto. So everybody that was doing things against you, because we didn't reserve that space, and even the taking of the flags, somebody can come back and say, I'm protected with a heckler's veto. What we're talking about is free speech. So she's essentially saying the destruction of this display was a form of free speech, and that we have to protect it. And it's a convoluted thing we're trying to stand here, saying the heckler's veto is protected. I don't know, Adam, can you unpack it for me and for the listeners?
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel to speech zones, which, as fans of Fire know, speech zones are unconstitutional because you can't comply with the First Amendment by showing the places you don't censor speech. You have to not censor speech in all the places. That's the obligation. Well, this interpretation of heckler's veto, what the heckler's veto actually says is that to the extent speakers are trying to, or hecklers are trying to silence speakers, the government has an obligation to prevent the hecklers from succeeding. So this idea that, well, if you had reserved the space, you would be entitled to the heckler's veto as it should exist. But because you didn't reserve the space, the heckler's veto means they have the right to interfere with your speech. It almost reimposes speech codes in this strange, paperwork regulatory way.
And Adam, can I just provide a clarifying point on your heckler's veto definition? When you say the government has to protect the speech, it means it can't shut down that group that's seeking to speak because there are hecklers out there that are seeking to shut it down. Correct?
Absolutely.
So the government can't shut down a speaker because they're are angry mobs outside the venue, unless there's just no conceivable way that the government can provide protection for those speakers. You know, it needs to do everything within its power to protect them. Correct?
Exactly. If there's no other way to stop loss of life or limb, then at that point, yes, they could take steps to delay the speech in question. But they have to do everything short of that. And that means whether that's providing security without charging the speaker for it, because that's heckler's veto by the purse. It's not any better. Whatever the state has to do to ensure the speech can continue safely is what the state has to do.
This is why you'll see, maybe sort of something that people actually see. This was, I think, used to be more common, but you'd see often in cities, somebody would bus in, like 12 Klan members from out of town, and they would decide to march through downtown or through a historically black part of the city. And you'd see the policemen sort of surrounding the Klan and making sure that they were able to do that. That is to prevent the hecklers from having a veto over speech. I think part of what I think may have been confusing this person here is that the heckler's veto is not an action, like it's not something we're trying to establish. What the courts say is that we cannot allow hecklers to have a veto over the speech, and when that is allowed, that's a heckler's veto. So I think she may have been thinking that like hecklers had an established right to veto things, but it's actually the opposite of that.
Yeah, and we should also clarify for our listeners, there is the legal concept that we had just discussed, but there's also this more amorphous cultural concept whereby when groups try to heckle a speaker and shut down speakers, that's often called a heckler's veto too, in the same way that, with the Muhammad cartoons or with the Charlie Hebdo massacre, we'll call those the assassin's veto. For example, it's not a formal legal topic or a legal concept, but it's kind of culturally what we call these sorts of shutting down of speech by hecklers or by assassins in the latter case. So it's often gets confused in this discussion whether you're talking about the cultural concept or the formal legal concept, which places a duty upon the government to prevent these sort of hecklers' vetoes. So, Adam, what ended up happening in this case? So there wasn't a full-throated defense of the student group's right to have this sort of campus event. I believe that is it correct to say that one of the students who stole the flags was charged with theft? Were they able to find one of the students?
They were charged with something, yeah. And they recovered the about 140 or 150 flags that student had. There's still another 150 or 160 flags floating out there somewhere that are unknown.
Yeah, but these events are, this sort of happens almost every year or every other year, where the pro-life student groups are putting up flags or other sorts of display to represent the lives lost to abortion, and they're just trampled over or stolen. I think there was one case we had, Robert, you might recall, about a decade ago, where a professor was one of the people doing the destruction of the event.
Yeah, we had one where my quote unquote favorite was probably where somebody decided to run over them with their car. They had the motorist vehicle, I guess, there. Yeah, the flag displays generally, it's one flag for every 1,000 abortions or whatever is how it's done. That they are it's a very common target for vandalism or for hecklers to try to establish a veto over that kind of speech.
I want to turn now, unless Adam, you had anything else you wanted to add.
Well, just one last thing there. That what the Young Conservatives were asking from the Dean of Students was for the school to make a statement condemning the destruction of the display, and that has still not happened. The school has still not made a statement saying, please don't go around destroying people's political displays. Because you wouldn't want to chill the
University
speech.
of North Texas is kind of on our list of bad actors and might actually be on our list of 10 worst colleges for free speech after earlier this year launching an investigation into a music professor who had published an article about I don't know, what was it, a composer, Robert? I don't know if you'll recall, but there was pushing back on accusations that this composer was racist, and apparently pushing back on those accusations that this...
It wasn't even that. It was pushing back on the idea that I believe it was pushing back on the idea that music theory
itself was racist.
This guy itself was racist because this guy Schenkner, who was an Austrian or something like that from back in the early 1900s, was alleged to have racist views or sympathy with fascism. And, there was a debate over whether that meant, because I guess Schenknerian music theory is a big deal. I have zero, I mean, I'm sure lots of people know more about this than I do, but, the idea is, was music theory itself a form of white supremacy or racist? And his pushing back on the idea that because, Schenkner was involved at the founding of this, he pushed back on the idea that that meant everything was racist. He was, really targeted by a lot of, I believe it was mostly grad students in the department, for, basically just sharing his academic opinion in a journal he edited called the Journal of Schenknerian Studies. I mean, we're talking
and it was in response to another scholar making this argument. So is it the sort of dialectic that you would hope would happen in an academic community?
Yeah, it has to happen, and it wasn't being allowed to. And yeah, UNT did not cover itself in glory there.
No. I want to turn now to the final case we're going to discuss. The previous one was about a pro-life display. This next one at the University of Northern Iowa is about a pro-life group. On October 7th, the Northern Iowa student government considered a bill to recognize a University of Northern Iowa chapter of Students for Life. This is a nationwide student organization with chapters on many different campuses, which is a pro-life student group, obviously. This bill failed 3-11 after an hour-long debate during which senators raised a litany of concerns, including that the organization was, quote, hateful, quote, infringed on human rights, and that recognizing the group would open the door to, quote, outside agitation on campus because of its affiliation with the National Organization of Students for Life. There's some more doozies from the student senators here. One senator said, "This is a hate group. This is hate speech. This is hateful rhetoric that is infringing on the human rights of healthcare." Another claimed this isn't about opinions. It's not about speech. It's not about censorship. It's about a specific group of people that are part of a national organization whose specific intended goal is to pursue actions that will be harmful to our community. And so they failed the student government to recognize this student group in violation of what we would argue are their First Amendment duties as an agent of the state. Robert, this isn't the first time we have seen a student government, as you said earlier, cover itself in glory, right? What are the duties of student governments when looking at student groups becoming a recognized student organization on any particular campus?
Yeah, so for when student governments traditionally have the power to recognize and often to fund, or at least to, by recognizing them, make them eligible for receiving funds for different student groups. When they are doing that, they are an agent of the university. They're basically the people the university has put in charge of doing this, and therefore they have the same responsibilities the university would. When they're at a public university like the University of Northern Iowa, that means they are an agency of the government, which means effectively they're acting in the place of the government. And so the government has certain obligations, in terms of First Amendment rights, one of the foremost and most obvious of which is not to engage in viewpoint-based discrimination, and obviously not to engage in censorship. And so what we've seen student governments do over and over again is they, instead of taking that responsibility seriously, or sometimes even having any awareness of that responsibility, they do use the viewpoints of the groups and their own opinions in order to determine, their own opinion on what that group believes, in order to determine whether or not they vote to recognize a student group. Now, they are supposed to be using their judgment for these things, but it's not supposed to be judgment based on viewpoint. For instance, let's say somebody turns in a constitution that doesn't make any sense, that doesn't comply with
a student group
requirements.
Constitution.
Maybe they don't have
a
student group constitution. Yes, I should say. Or let's say they apply for funding for we all want to go to New Orleans and get trashed event. That's the kind of thing that you'd expect a student government to exercise its judgment on, and that's where and examples of where they could say no. But simply saying the word hate over and over again, or claiming that it's not about opinions, it's not about speech, when it in fact is about opinions and speech, as it was here, does not relieve you of that responsibility. Students for Life, like you said, is a national organization. It has chapters on many, many campuses. The fact that they're affiliated with it, or the fact that they are going to, oppose abortion, which is, very, that's obviously pro-life and pro-choice activism are, core parts of political speech in the United States, is not a legitimate reason to turn down a student group for recognition. And even though that seems to be exactly what you and I did there, and left plenty of evidence explaining that why they did it.
And one of the student senators even knew that not recognizing the group based on the fact that they just didn't like the viewpoint of this group, would open them up to a sort of legal liability. The senator opined that recognizing the group because they were concerned about legal liability was, quote, extremely facile and weak. It was an extremely facile and weak defense that, quote, privileged money and admins over student well-being. Now, this was appealed to the Northern Iowa Student Government Supreme Court, where they once again denied this group the right to become an officially recognized chapter, apparently on the grounds that the organization was not formed in, quote, good faith for a lawful purpose, whatever that means. But, we wrote to the University of Northern Iowa's president, Mark Nook, who overturned, thankfully, the student government decision and granted formal recognition to Students for Life. In his decision, he noted, universities exist to give students and all members of the community an opportunity to wrestle with a vast diversity of ideas and opinions, to challenge their perception of their own identity and the beliefs and opinions of others, and to grow in their understanding of natural and social systems. So, a good outcome to that case, where we haven't had a good outcome to the previous three cases that we discussed. So it's probably a good place to end, unless Robert or Adam, you had anything else you wanted to add on this case in particular.
Yeah. Asking, a student government decision to be overturned is not something that FIRE does lightly. We want student governments to have autonomy and authority. We don't want them to just simply be the puppet of the university. Otherwise, if they're going to do that, then why have a student government at all? However, they do have these legal responsibilities. FIRE, we try to reach out often to student governments. If we hear about it soon enough, we'll say, hey, we'll write a letter to the student government folks themselves, explaining the law to them, asking them to do the right thing. Sometimes that works. I'd say probably more often it doesn't. However, we have had a lot of success in, when there is a obvious case of viewpoint discrimination here. We've actually had a great deal of success in getting university administrations to overturn the decisions of the student government and go ahead and recognize the groups anyway. It is a very obviously and well-established principle that they have to do that. It is unfortunate. I think they could, certainly they could and should be doing more to educate student government officials on, their responsibilities. These are, look, I understand, student government is, not always a real overly serious thing, but, in this particular matter, you are really wielding the power of the state. And I think student government officials could really be a lot more educated and take a lot more seriously the fact that, the sovereign state of Iowa has given you a share of its power, and you have to use that responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility, and to do that. So I'm glad that Northern Iowa did that. I hope this will stand for some kind of education there. I wish it were less common than it is. And I think schools could be doing a lot more to educate student governments on this stuff, particularly when it is actual, their actual legal obligations.
Well, Robert and Adam, I think we will leave it there. Thank you both for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Happy to do it.
This podcast is hosted, produced, and recorded by me, Nico Perino, and edited by Aaron Reese. To learn more about So to Speak, you can follow us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk, or you can like us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. We take feedback at so to speak @thefire.org. If you enjoyed this episode, it'd be good for you and better for us if you consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. They help us attract new listeners to the show and consequently new listeners to the concepts of free speech and open dialogue. Until next time, I thank you all again for listening.